Okay, I'll open a word of prayer. Lord, thanks for this day. Pray you'll bless this message to everyone's hearts. In Jesus' name, amen. Couldn't think of anything more to say. First time, I know, right? I heard that back there. I won't say who did that, Wes Turner, but... So we're in the book of Acts, and today's passage is a little bit different. We're in Acts chapter 12, if you want to open to that. I'm going to read from the passage, and usually in my updates, I always put a thing in that generative AI or AI was not used in the preparation of this, but I did this week. I found a picture of Herod Agrippa. We're going to talk about him at the end of this today. Pride will lead to a fall. And so I said, I want a old castle with stone walls and floors in a throne room. And I put that in the background. So it's pretty amazing stuff. So next I'm going to ask it to fix my putting stroke. And that might crash. I don't think they have enough stuff here. We've been talking in Acts. We've gone through at least the messages I've done. I've talked about an intro to Peter's sermon on Pentecost. I talked about Stephen's sermon. I also talked about the sermon at the second sermon in Acts. And all of them sort of pull in the same history. And a lot of this relates to, I talk a lot about Bible prophecy, and it relates to God's calendar. This is the feast. I don't like that they're called the Feast of Israel. I think that's a misnomer. I think that's incorrect. They're actually the Feast of the Lord, because what do? They teach us about the Lord. And so as we're getting towards what we think is the end, what we call the fall feast or winter feast, because they really only had two seasons in Israel, summer and winter. But there was an agricultural cycle that these feasts were tied to, because the land teaches them and everything teaches them. Everything about Israel teaches them about the Lord. And God uses this in the way the prophets deal with people. So we have these fall feasts that I think are going to be fulfilled in date order in one calendar cycle, just like they were the first time. And that may be a little ways off, but I don't think it's too far off. We know that even Jesus celebrated Hanukkah, and I think that is a biblical feast, and it will be celebrated in the future by Jesus as he dedicates a temple for the millennium. Before I start, let me say, by the way, I don't know if the movie Route 60, The Biblical Highway, is still out. It played last week. Pam and I went. If you can get a chance, I think a DVD will be coming out in mid-October. And I know it's produced by TBN, and I have my issues with TBN, but it's excellent if you can go see it. Route 60. And you can find information at route60.movie.movie, route60.movie. It features largely Route 60, which is the highway of the Patriarchs, Avenue of the Patriarchs in Israel. They start in Nazareth, and they go all the way down to in the north, and they go all the way down to the end of Route 60 in Beersheba in the south, stopping along the way at Shem or Shechem. And I'm supposed to say Shem, I'm supposed to do something in the middle of that word. David Friedman does it better than I do. It features David Friedman and Mike Pompeo doing the narration and talking. I just think the graphics are just incredible, what they've done with the graphics. And so they go to Shechem, we would call it Shechem, Mount Ebal, Joseph's tomb, Jerusalem, Rachel's tomb, and then Hebron and Beersheba. So would highly recommend that. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to just share with you a few passages. We're going to look at the text, and I can't say that there's any great, big, deep, theological, doctrinal thing coming out of Acts chapter 12. There's principle that comes out of it, but I don't think there's a doctrine. But it is, pride will lead to a fall, and that's very important. But so we'll talk. Well, I'm going to read the text. Then I have sort of a background of Herod Agrippa, so you can kind of understand where did all that pride come from that he had. And then, and it's a fascinating story of the Herodian dynasty in Israel. And Herod was I believe, kind of hard to tell because they sort of intermarried people. Sisters, cousins, and I'll read part of a Wikipedia entry, and Herod Agrippa I think he was the son and nephew of one person, the same person. It was very, very bizarre. So let's start. Let's look at the text in Acts chapter 12. And I'm going to use a translation called the Legacy Standard Bible. I know that will upset a lot of people. Usually when I do my Bible study, by the way, Bible Gateway is a great website, and you can set up like 3, 4, 5, 6 parallel passages, parallel translations. So I'll look at King James, New King James, New American Standard, 1995 version, and then Legacy Standard Bible is one that I've added. And I think it's pretty good. It's an update of the New American Standard. And I know there are some issues with some of the manuscripts that they put things in quotes or in brackets that they don't think are really part of the text, but they put them in the text anyway. But it's kind of an update of the New American Standard, and I just like it because the New American Standard and this translation, the Legacy Standard Bible, they pick up the verb tenses, which are really important. They do a better job of translating the verb tenses from Greek and Hebrew. So, and that's kind of important sometimes. So anyway, Acts chapter 12, verse 1. Now, about the time Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to harm them, and he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread, when he had seized him, when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. So Peter was kept in prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church to God. Now in the very night when Herod was about to bring him forward, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and guards in front of the door were watching over the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared, and a light shone in the cell. And he struck Peter's side and woke him up, saying, "Rise up quickly." And his chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, "Gird yourself and put on your sandals." And he did so. And he said to him, "Wrap your garment around yourself and follow me." And he went out and continued to follow. And he did not know what was being done by the angel. He did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, but was thinking he was seeing a vision. And when they had passed the first and second guard posts, they came to the iron gate that leads into the city, which opened for them by itself. And they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. When Peter came to himself, he said, "Now I truly know that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." Because what do you think they were going to do? They were probably thinking they were going to do the same thing to Peter that had been done to Jesus, that they would bring up an accusation with him, and the Romans would take care of the Roman government in charge under Herod would do something about it. And when he realized this, verse 12, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. Likely this could be the upper room again. And when he had knocked at the door of the gate, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. And when she recognized Peter's voice, because of her joy, she did not open the gate, but she ran in and reported that Peter was standing in front of the gate. And they said to her, "You are out of your mind." But she kept insisting that it was so. They kept saying, "It is his angel." But Peter continued knocking, and when they opened the door, they saw him and were astounded. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he recounted to them how the Lord had let him out of the prison. And he said, "Report these things to James and the brothers." Then he left and went to another place. Now when day came, there was no small disturbance among the soldiers as to what had become of Peter. And when Herod had searched for him and had not found him, he examined the guards and ordered that they be led away to execution. Then he went down from Judea to Caesarea and was spending time there. Now he was very angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon, and with one accord they came to him, and having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain, they were asking for peace. Interesting that you ask a guy named Blastus to bring peace. Because their country was fed by the king's country. And on the appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel and sitting on the judgment seat, began delivering an address to them. And the assembly kept crying out, "The voice of God, a God and not of a man." And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and breathed his last. But the word of the Lord continued to grow and to be multiplied, and Barnabas and Saul returned to Jerusalem, fulfilling their ministry, taking along with them John, who was also called Mark. And we know later that Paul and Barnabas actually split up over, well, by then he was named Paul. Paul and Barnabas split up over a disagreement over John Mark. Paul got angry and they split. I've heard people say that they think that the most important person in the New Testament outside of Jesus was Barnabas. Now, why do they say that? Because Barnabas took John Mark under his wing. And if you go to 2 Timothy chapter 4, the last things that Paul's written, I did a series once called Famous Last Words. Because you think, when people know they're dying, they kind of get right to the heart of the matter. And so in 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul gets to that. And one of the things he says there is, despite this dispute that has gone on for a long time, bring John Mark to me. Because he wanted to see him, because he would edify Paul in Paul's most, I guess you would call it, a desperate hours. He's getting ready to be executed. Now he knows the result's going to be good, but nobody wants the execution part. You hope that that's how it's going to be, you hope that it's quick and painless. But John Mark also probably wrote the first gospel that was circulated among the church. We did a series on Mark, or I did a series on Mark a long time ago, and it was a gospel of action. This happened and this happened and this happened. There wasn't much transition stuff. It was just went from one vignette to the next. But so Paul gets, the people don't believe that Paul is really alive, or Peter is really alive. They don't believe it. They don't believe the young lady who says, he's out at the gate, he's out at the gate. They don't believe it. And then they finally do it. And Peter says, look, calm down, it's me. The angel of the Lord came and rescued me. Now, I don't think this is a passage that's normative for the church, and that the church should always expect when you get thrown in prison that an angel of the Lord is going to come, strike you on the side, tell you to get dressed, and then lead you out of the prison. That's just not the way that it works. But it was interesting that they were praying for Peter, and then Peter showed up, and they were like, well, that can't be Peter. It has to be his angel. So, what were you praying for, right? And so sometimes, when we pray, we need to understand that God will maybe actually answer our prayer literally, which is interesting. So, but the focus, I think, of this passage is on Herod and what happened to Herod and the pride of Herod when the people were saying, this is the voice of a God and not of a man. He didn't correct them. He let them go. So I think if you look at the history of Herod and his family, you can kind of get, how does a guy get that prideful? When someone says, you're a god, and you believe them. By the way, not a problem around the Haller house. That's it just never comes up in that way. Yet, no. But so there's this. So I have a couple different charts of how all of these people fit together. Of course, Herod the Great, he was the king at the time of Jesus' birth. Probably died, I'm not sure he died about 4 BC. I think he probably died around 2 BC. Tried to kill Jesus. Remember, he killed all the children in Bethlehem under the age of 2 because he wanted to be sure he got the guy that the Magi from the east had identified as the king of the Jews. He, even though he was getting up there in age, he was, and when I say he took care of them, he was like a mafia don. He took care of them. He got rid of them, killed them, even his own sons. So this is a biography of Herod Agrippa, and this comes from the great unbiased source Wikipedia, but it's actually pretty good. So this time you can believe it. Herod Agrippa was the last Jewish king of Judea. He ruled from about 41 AD to 44 AD. He was a grandson of Herod the Great and the father of Herod Agrippa II, the last known king of the Herodian dynasty. He was acquaintance or friend of Roman emperors, just like his grandfather had been, and even played crucial roles in internal Roman politics. This is kind of interesting. So here's this person from the far reaches of the Roman Empire, and this is what it says. He spent his childhood and youth at the imperial court in ancient Rome, where he befriended the imperial princes Claudius and Drusus, the son of Tiberius. He suffered a period of disgrace following the death of Drusus, which forced him to return to live in Judea. Back in Rome around 35 AD, Tiberius made him the guardian of his grandson, Tiberius Gemellus, and Agrippa approached the other designated heir, Caligula. The advent of the latter to the throne allowed him to become king of these different provinces in 37 by obtaining the old tetrarchies of Philip and Lysanias of Galilee and Perea in 40, following the disgrace of his uncle, Herod Antipas. After the assassination of Caligula, he played a leading role in Rome in the accession of Claudius to the head of the empire in 41 and was endowed with the former territories of Archelaus. That would be Idumea, Judea, and Samaria, thus ruling over a territory as vast as the ancient kingdom of Herod the Great. Carrying a dual Jewish and Roman identity, he played the role of intercessor on behalf of the Jews with the Roman authorities on the domestic level, and on the domestic level gave hope to some of his Jewish subjects of the restoration of an independent kingdom. So, in other words, some of the Jews at that time were looking at him almost as a messianic figure. He was going to come and set up the kingdom that Jesus had not set up, and that they had, when he offered it to them, they rejected it. Now, if you go into the different parts of his life, he was born about 11 BC. He was born in Caesarea on the coast. And you can see that he had this relationship with Herodias, who was Philip's wife. So his uncle's wife became his wife. So he was the nephew. That's very strange. And so this was what had happened. And we know Herodias, she was the one who demanded the head of John the Baptist and was given the head of John the Baptist. But Antipas, she was the wife of Antipas, I'm sorry. But so Antipas' wife, this is all just bizarre. So he was the nephew of Herod Antipas, but he married his aunt. And that and you can read about that in Matthew chapter 14. Herod the Great is therefore, this Wikipedia entry says, both the paternal grandfather and the maternal great uncle of Agrippa. So it's just a very strange thing. So this is a little bit of the geography that's going on at the time. You can see the different, this is at the time of Herod. This is a great, I don't know, I think this is a German website where I found some of these maps. And you can see some of these areas were given to Herod Agrippa, including up there Perea and some of those other provinces, so that he did rule a large portion of that land. Perea being up there to the east of the Jordan there, around Philadelphia. Is that Philadelphia? Yeah, Philadelphia. So again, but understand what he grew up in. He grew up in abject splendor. He spent time in Rome, among the Romans, and Rome was the great city of the world at that time. If you've ever been to Rome and seen some of the ruins there, the things that were built and lasted for a very long time. Rome ruled until the 500 AD, and it was this great imperial capital. Herod, his grandfather and great uncle, had built a number of phenomenal cities. This is Caesarea on the Mediterranean. Some of you have been there. You can see the great amphitheater in the back, and when they were excavating the amphitheater, they turned over one of the seats, and they found this stone which identified a guy named Pontius Pilate. And until that time, a lot of people questioned the truth of Scripture because there was no external reference to Pontius Pilate, who had tried Jesus before his crucifixion. But here it was in stone. And what they do over there too, by the way, when something falls apart and they rebuild it, they don't take that stone and they move it over here to someplace else. They take the stone, they turn it over and use it if they can. And that's how they sort of unpack these different layers of archaeology. So there was a phenomenal port had been built there. Herod had also built memorials to people. This is in Hebron. This is Mamre. I've talked a lot about that. You can see the site there. And Herod had built, you can see some of the walls there that are built. The parapets are very identical to what they are at the Temple Mount and down at Machpelah. So that's Mamre and Hebron. He built that. And he built that because he was making a memorial for the Jewish people, Herod the Great. He wanted them to remember where things have been built. And this is where Abraham received the promise. Read about that in Genesis chapter 18. Yahweh met Abram by the great oaks of Mamre. And this is Lean Rittmeyer, a great archaeologist in Israel, has done this is what the Herodian structure probably looked like at the time of Herod. You just have some of the base parts of the wall now that you can see there, but there was an altar there and that type of thing. Then Herod also built in Hebron, a couple miles away, less than 2 miles away, at the tomb of the patriarchs at Machpelah, which you can see there on the right. This is what it looks like as you approach it today. There's a area here on the lower right-hand corner that you can see that sort of the wall is a bit discolored. And that's because that's what the Jewish worshipers call the seventh step. For hundreds of years after the Muslims came and took over the area, the Jews were not allowed to go into the structure to pray. Now, they don't go to the structure, by the way, to pray to Abraham or to pray to Rebecca or Sarah or Isaac or Jacob or Leah. They're buried in a cave. Their bones are in a cave down beneath, but they go there to remember what those people meant for the Jewish people and the nation of Israel. And of course, these were the patriarchs and matriarchs of Israel. So the Muslims said you can only go to the seventh step to pray. And so you can see they prayed there a lot because the wall is discolored even to this day. And here's a little aerial shot of the Tomb of the Patriarchs. On the one end is a Jewish synagogue. That's on this end. Wait a minute, I've got to get, towards us. And then the further end is a Muslim mosque. And it's divided. It's a point of great contention in probably what may be the most divided city in the modern state of Israel between the Arabs and the Jews. Fascinating place. Been there a number of times. So here is and then here it also, so he built at Mamre, where the promise of the Son was given, the promise of the Messiah. Abraham would have a son in whom all nations of the world would be blessed. Then he built at Machpelah, which is where they were buried. And if you understand how the Jewish people look at the story of Genesis and the story of what happened at Machpelah when Jacob and Esau came together and reconciled for a bit at the funeral of their father Isaac, they interpret that as a prophetic thing that will happen in the future, that there will be reconciliation between the Jews and Arabs someday. And they believe it will happen here at Hebron. And it's kind of interesting, if you as I was preparing my update for this week, let me tell you, I literally could go 5 or 6 hours today. I know you find that hard to believe, but I can see the look of shock on some faces back there. But because one of the things that they talked about was this was a big week for Bible prophecy, as they talked at the UN and elsewhere all over the place about reconciliation between Jews and Arabs, peace between Jews and Arabs. It's very significant things that are happening, and I'll talk about that in my update. But then Herod also built at the Temple Mount. He built this, enlarged the Temple Mount, built this great temple. It was covered with gold, and of course that was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. So Herod Agrippa, he took over eventually as you get into his life. He gets the places of Idumea and all the way down into southern Judah and then up to the north. So he had a fairly significant territory from a biblical standpoint that he governed. And he governed this in the early days of the church. But he didn't really seem to care that much about the church. He thought he could handle it. And when people did come, as the text says, when they were calling him, this is a man who speaks as a God, it's a voice of a God and not of a man, he was a bit full of himself. And we know what happened. He died and he was eaten by worms. So there used to be a joke that they exhumed the body of Mozart. Have you heard this? And they opened the grave and they found him decomposing. So Herod Agrippa, they found him composting. I could tell by the groans that I really nailed that one. So I had Wes read the story of Nebuchadnezzar, and we saw the story of Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4, that Nebuchadnezzar was filled with pride. He thought very lofty of himself. He felt as himself as a god. And what did God do? God took his mind from him. And he became as a beast, eating grass for 7 years. And then it returned him, and when it returned him, he praised the Lord. So he got it. But he was judged. And I think the clear meaning of the text there is, you better not think too much of yourself. You better not think of yourself as a god. And then turn over to 1 Kings chapter 22. This is the story of Ahab is visited by, he's the king of Israel. He had this nice little lady for his wife named Jezebel. She didn't have a very good end, but Jehoshaphat, the king of Judah, came to Ahab, and we see this in verse 5, what happened. And you can kind of see what happens here where pride leads you. Verse 5 of 1 Kings 22. Moreover, Jehoshaphat said to the king of Israel, please inquire first for the word of Yahweh. Then the king of Israel gathered the prophets together, about 400 men, and said to them, shall I go against Ramoth-Gilead to battle, or shall I refrain? And they said, 400 of them, go up, for the Lord will give it into the hand of the king. But Jehoshaphat, he wasn't really buying the 400. He said, is there not yet a prophet of Yahweh here that we may inquire of him? And the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, there is yet one man by whom we may inquire of Yahweh, but I hate him, because he does not prophesy good to me concerning me, but evil. He is Micaiah the son of Imlah. Jehoshaphat said, let not the king say so. Then the king of Israel called an officer and said, hasten to bring Micaiah son of Imlah. Now the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, were sitting each on his throne, clothed in their royal garments, at the threshing floor at the entrance of the gate of Samaria. And all the prophets were prophesying before them. By the way, we went to Samaria, and we saw the tomb of Ahab, where Ahab and his father Omri had been buried in the area of the palace. So this is obviously before this. Verse 11, and Zedekiah, the son of a guy who had a funny name, made horns of iron for himself and said, thus says Yahweh, with these you will gore the Arameans until they are confused. All the prophets were also prophesying, thus saying, go up to Ramoth-Gilead and succeed, and Yahweh will give it into the hand of the king. Now the messenger who went to summon Micaiah spoke to him, saying, behold now the words of the prophets, as if from one mouth, are good towards the king. Please let your word be like the word of one of them, and speak that which is good. But Micaiah said, as Yahweh lives, what Yahweh says to me, that I shall speak. Then he came to the king, and the king said to Micaiah, shall we go up to Ramoth-Gilead to battle, or shall we refrain? And he said to him, go up and succeed, and Yahweh will give it into the hand of the king. And obviously he's mocking him here. He's saying what the king wants to hear. Then the king said to him, how many times must I make you swear that you will speak to me nothing but the truth of the name of Yahweh? So he said, I saw all Israel scattered on the mountains, like sheep which have no shepherd. And Yahweh said, these have no master, let each of them return to his house in peace. Then the king of Israel said to Jehoshaphat, did I not say to you that he would not prophesy concerning me, but evil? And we know that the rest of the story goes on, that Ahab did go in, and because there was a little chink in his armor, he got hit by he listened to the 400. So if you want to understand sort of the ratio of good prophets to bad prophets at any time in Bible history, including our day, it's usually a pretty good assumption that there's at least 400 bad prophets for every one prophet, good prophet. And I think the ratio is actually a little bit higher now than it used to be back then. But 400 to 1 is usually a pretty good thing. But Ahab believed the good because he wanted to hear good news. So he didn't listen to the one prophet who was telling him the truth. And that ought to be a big lesson for us, so we not let our pride get in the way, because what happened to Ahab? Ahab let his pride get in the way, that he only wanted good news. And that would be very easy. By the way, you may not have noticed, but I talk a lot about bad news because there's plenty of that. Because I don't want to end up like Ahab, to be honest with you, because I think we need to speak the truth. But people are very popular. They're from movements in politics, including on the conservative side, and among what I would call the dominionists in our world, that everything's going to work out okay, everything's going to be great. Now, I think everything is going to work out okay, and everything's going to be great, but there's some interim things in between. Jesus is going to take care of it. I don't think we're going to bring in the kingdom of God. I just don't think that that's going to happen. Now, that doesn't mean we should give up and not do anything or not speak up against this nonsense. But we live at this time. I'm going to play a couple clips for you. Don't usually do this in the sermon, but we're living at a time with artificial intelligence, general artificial intelligence, generative artificial intelligence, where people are beginning to think very highly of themselves. I played the clip very often of Yuval Harari speaking at Google headquarters in 2015. And he says, I love coming to Silicon Valley, get to see my good friend over here, but I also like coming to Silicon Valley because it is here that the religions that will control humanity in the 21st century are being created. And he says this. So this week, there was a meeting in Silicon Valley attended by Elon Musk, the richest man in the world, Max Tegmark, a professor at MIT, and you might have seen some of the clips I played of him where he said, this artificial intelligence thing is not, I don't trust it. I think it's getting out of control. I don't know what will happen to humanity. A guy named Daniel David Brockman, who's one of the chief executives of OpenAI, probably the most powerful artificial intelligence company in the world, and a world leader from a high-tech country called Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, speaking in San Francisco. Did any of you see this interview? Oh, good. Then it will be fresh. I want you to listen very carefully to this because the lessons that we see in Acts chapter 12 about pride leading to a fall are coming on this world. And we know there's going to be one guy who's going to come, who's going to say, I have the answers. Daniel describes him as Mr. Big Mouth, as for lack of a better term. He's going to exalt himself. In 2 Thessalonians 2, he goes into the temple and declares himself above all that is called God. But I want you to see how what's going on in our world is building the stage for this. So here we go. Elon Musk, Max Tegmark, Benjamin Netanyahu, and Mr. Brockman.
You know, the very positive scenario of AI is actually in a lot of ways the description of heaven. In that really nobody would need to work. I wouldn't even call it universal basic income. I would say it's probably universal high income. I'm describing the best case scenario here. So I'm not saying this is definitely what will occur. There's a range of scenarios from very negative to very positive. The very positive scenario is basically sounds like heaven. You can have whatever you want. You don't need to work. You have no obligations. Any illness you have can be cured. You know, and
when do we die?
Well, that's a good question.
I think it'll be a choice.
Yeah, I think it probably ends up being somewhat of a choice.
Also, that everyone gets a great education, right? You know, everyone has that story of that one teacher that they had who paid attention to them and inspired them on a specific subject. Imagine if you had that teacher for anything you wanted constantly, and just how much better people would we be, how much better would we relate to others. Like, that is just one example of the kinds of upsides that are possible. And I think the question of, well, what does it mean to be a human? You know, if you, back to how do you predict what's going to come next? Actually, the thinker who I think had the best foresight about how the AI revolution was going to play out is actually Ray Kurzweil. You know,
I agree.
Yeah, and his book Singularity is Near gets like a lot. I think that people, you know, kind of assume it's going to be this almost like just sort of religious text, but instead it's a very dry analytical text.
So Kurzweil's an engineer with Google. You might remember a cover that was based on what he said back in, goodness, this was about 12 years ago. Time cover, it said year 2045, had a picture of a bald-headed human with a wire coming out of the back of their head. 2045, the year man becomes immortal. And that's when Kurzweil said the singularity was going to come, where humans and machine were going to merge into humans 2.0. At least the elite are going to do that. The rest of you may not be making the cut, by the way. But that's what's going to happen. I mean, this is not science fiction. Kurzweil came out this week, though, and said the singularity is going to come 2030. And I think we're going to reach the merging part in 2029. And so these guys are talking about that. What does that mean?
2028.
Hang on a second.
What
here.
does the world look like? How will I...
Go back here.
You know, the need to work, you have not
die. One teacher that they had who paid attention to them and inspired them on a specific subject. Imagine if you had that teacher for anything you wanted constantly, and just how much better people would we be, how much better would we relate to others. Like, that is just one example of the kinds of upsides that are possible.
So AI is
and
going
I
to
think the question of, well, what does it mean to be a human? You know, if you, back to how do you predict what's going to come next? Actually, the thinker who I think had the best foresight about how the AI revolution was going to play out is actually Ray Kurzweil. You know,
I agree.
Yeah, and his book Singularity is Near gets like a lot. I think that people, you know, kind of assume it's going to be this almost like just sort of religious text, but instead it's a very dry analytical text. And he just looks at the compute curves and he says, this is the fundamental unlocker of intelligence. Everyone thought that was crazy, and now it's basically true. It's basically common wisdom. And part of what he says is, look, what's going to happen is in 2030s, first of all, he says AGI 2029.
Yeah, I keep telling people, it seems to be almost exactly right.
It's spooky. It's spooky. 2030s is when the merge happens. So we've got Neuralink coming, and you know, maybe other systems like that. And what does it mean once you actually are kind of merging with an intelligent?
And so that was the discussion that they had, and it's the way I kind of view it is. So I'm thinking of this in context of Acts chapter 12, where we know this pride got to Herod Agrippa. You know, he came from this family that built all this fantastic stuff in Israel, some of the most magnificent buildings in the world, including the tomb of the patriarchs at Hebron, which still exists today, pretty much as he built it. They've added some stuff on the top, but it's been through earthquakes and it's stood the test of time. And when you build something like that, it's human nature that it goes to your head. And so the question, though, in the world that we're living in, when we know that there's false Christ coming, what happens when there are a whole bunch of Herod Agrippas around that have pride, that think they are God? So here's one. Now, in this case, I think he's just sort of reporting on what he sees, but I've played many clips of him. Here's Yuval Harari and another guy. They're having a debate on the safety of AI. In fact, that was the panel that Netanyahu was on, the safety of AI safety panel. And so The Economist, a few days before, it had a conversation with Yuval Harari and this other guy and they were sort of having a debate about whether AI could be safe. And Tegmark, in a later portion of that video that I just played, he says, well, maybe we should ask the question, like, what's the next step for humans? Will there be jobs? And he says, that's not the question we should be asking. The question we should be asking is, will there be humans? And Max is a very smart guy. And Netanyahu, he sort of said, well, you know, we think there'll be good things, but we got to take care of the bad things. But I'm watching this pretty closely, and guess what? I don't see anybody taking care of the bad things. And it's rocketing to a very swift existential threat to humanity conclusion. The weapon systems that are being developed, Israel now has developed an AI-operated gun. And the statements made to describe it are, you don't need to you can use it, but you don't even need to be a good shot. You don't need to be a marksman, because it will take out the target. Whether you're shooting it in the right direction or not, it will override you and do that. They have a new AI battle tank. You'll see a clip of that in the second hour. So then they ask Harari a little bit about this. So you're going to hear the first guy. The question is, what's the world going to look like in 2028, 5 years from now? And here's the discussion. This is put up in The Economist magazine.
2028. What does the world look like? How will I interact with AIs? What will we all be doing and not doing?
Well, let's just look back over the last 10 years to get a sense of the trajectory that we're on and the incredible momentum that I think everybody can now see with the generative AI revolution. Over the last 10 years, we've become very, very good at classifying information. We can understand it, we sort it, label it, organize it. And that classification has been critical to enabling this next wave, because we can now read the content of images, we can understand text pretty well, we can classify audio and transcribe it into text. The machines can now have a pretty good sense of the conceptual representations in those ideas. The next phase of that is what we're seeing now with the generative AI revolution. We can now produce new images, new videos, new audio, and of course, new language. And in the last year or so, with the rise of ChatGPT and other AI models, it's pretty incredible to see how plausible and accurate and very finesse to these new language models are. In the next 5 years, the frontier model companies, those of us at the very cutting edge who are training the very largest AI models, are going to train models that are over 1,000 times larger than what you currently see today in GPT-4. And with each new order of magnitude in compute, that is 10x more compute used, we tend to see really new capabilities emerge. And we predict that the new capabilities that will come this time over the next 5 years will be the ability to plan over multiple time horizons. Instead of just generate new text in a one shot, the model will be able to generate a sequence of actions over time. And I think that that's really the character of AI that we'll see in the next 5 years. Artificial capable AIs. AIs that can't just say things, they can also do things.
But what does that actually mean in practice? Just use your imagination. Tell me what my life will be like in 2028. How will I interact with them? What will I do? What will be different?
So I've actually proposed a modern Turing test, which tries to evaluate for exactly this point, right? The last Turing test simply evaluated for what a machine could say, assuming that what it could say represented its intelligence. Now that we're kind of approaching that moment where these AI models are pretty good, arguably they've passed the Turing test, or maybe they will in the next few years. The real question is, how can we measure what they can do? So I've proposed a test which involves them going off and taking a $100,000 investment, and over the course of 3 months, trying to set about creating a new product, researching the market, seeing what consumers might like, generating some new images, some blueprints of how to manufacture that product, contacting a manufacturer, getting it made, negotiating the price, drop shipping it, and then ultimately collecting the revenue. And I think that over a 5-year period, it's quite likely that we will have an ACI, an artificial capable intelligence, that can do the majority of that task autonomously. It won't be able to do the whole thing. There are many tricky steps along the way, but significant portions of that. It will be able to make phone calls to other humans to negotiate. It will be able to call other AIs in order to establish the right sequence in a supply chain, for example. And of course, it will learn to use APIs, application programming interfaces, so other websites or other knowledge bases or other information stores. And so, the world is your oyster. You can imagine that being applied to many, many different parts of our economy.
So Yuval, a man who doesn't use a smartphone very much, you listen to this. Does this fill you with horror, and do you agree with it? Do you think that's the kind of thing that is likely to happen in the next 5 years?
I would take it very seriously. I don't know. I'm not coming from within the industry, so I cannot comment on how likely it is to happen. But when I hear this as a historian, for me, what we just heard, this is the end of human history. Not the end of history, the end of human-dominated history. History will continue with somebody else in control. Because what we just heard is basically Mustafa telling us that in 5 years, there'll be a technology that can make decisions independently and that can create new ideas independently. This is the first time in history we confronted something like this. Every previous technology in history, from a stone knife to nuclear bombs, it could not make decisions. Like the decision to drop the bomb on Hiroshima was not made by the atom bomb. It was made by President Truman. And similarly, it can, every previous technology in history, it could only replicate our ideas. Like radio or the printing press, it could make copies and disseminate the music or the poems or the novels that some human wrote. Now we have a technology that can create completely new ideas. And it can do it at a scale far beyond what humans are capable of.
So it can create new ideas, and in important areas within 5 years we'll be able to enact them. And that is a profound shift. Before we go on to the many ways in which this could be the end of...
Well, that's interesting, isn't it? So back to Herod. So when I was preparing this, I found this image online. So I cut out the throne and took out the background. And then I went to Photoshop and I said, I want a background. And I told you this at the beginning. And I said, I want a background with a, I want a background of a ancient stone castle, stone wall, stone floor, throne room. That's all I put. That's what I put in. And it came up with this. By the way, I looked for that image, the background image, and I could not find it. And because you can search by image on Google, just drag an image over and it will do a search for you of all these. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, you just have to go to a library and go through stacks and stacks of books to try to find it, and then you have to find a good picture. Then you had to go to a photocopier and hope you didn't get the corner of it. It was all curled up because it was in the binding of a book. You remember those days. And I used to do these reports when I was in fourth grade. I was doing PowerPoint before Bill Gates invented it and became the wealthiest man in the world. I would take a razor and I would cut the center section of National Geographic magazines. I do like a report on Egypt or the Nile River. So I'd find it, I'd put it on a white paper, and then we had that opaque projector, the one that you could kind of see if all the lights were out and they blacked out all the windows. That big giant can that had a little 25 lumen light, like a weak flashlight. But it's such a strange time to be alive because this stuff is happening. And you can see what's happening with these people. I mean, Elon Musk, he's going to move everybody to another planet. That's what he's thinking. And he grew up as in a technocratic home with a very unloving father. There's a new biography out about him. But what's it going to be like in 5 years when everybody's prideful? How do we stay grounded? Well, you got to stay grounded in the Word. I just think it's going to be a difficult time. I don't know how else to say that. So be careful that the pride does not overtake you. He was talking about marketing plan. We're going to do a marketing plan. Well, we'll have it someday. It's already doing marketing plans. Do you understand? I get these feeds every day from an AI source, and there's 40 new applications, 80 new applications a week at least, including somebody who contacted me I don't even know if it was a real person. It showed up in my text and says, I can help you use AI to generate a marketing plan for your company. Okay. How did I get that? So I'm just saying be very careful and be instructive to people about pride in this day and age, because pride will lead to a fall. That's the clear implication of Acts chapter 12. Let's pray. Lord, thanks for this day. Lord, we pray that you will help us to give us wisdom, give us an extra dose of the Holy Spirit to guide us through the very difficult times that we're coming upon, that will be able to determine what's real and what's not real, but that we will always stand for the truth of your word and the truth